Now, in thinking which story I was going to tell tonight, like I did suggest, tell your favourite story. But I really haven't got a favourite story because it's like choosing between your children, isn't it? I've probably written over 100 stories over the years. So I thought I'd tell the first one that I told that very first night. And it's called The Day the Desks Attacked. It was just an ordinary Monday. The alarm went off at 6:30 and then I went back to sleep, and then half an hour later my mum comes in berating me to get me big posterior out of bed because we're like going in 20 minutes. I hate Mondays. The only thing worse than Mondays is like Tuesdays after a long weekend. Anyway, I got dressed, gobbled down 6 Weet-Bix and made it to the garage before Mum had a spazzo attack. And then like 20 minutes later, we were at St Petrowski's Lethargy College, the third best school in Australia, they reckon. They must have taken the survey when there was only like 3 schools in Australia. I hate St Petrowski's. The only time I like St Petrowski's is like in holidays, or on the weekends it's all right too. Anyway, the mum just dropped me off, and the first person I saw when I walked through the gate was Hilary Jacobson. Hilary created a new meaning for the word obnoxious. I used to call her the linguistic chicken because her language was so foul. I was trying to avoid her, and she calls out to me, she says, "Hey, dickhead, emu legs." Oh, geez, I can't help it if I got my dad's legs. I wish I'd have come back like my friend Stephanie Atkinson. Stephanie's words really burn, just like the hydrochloric acid that went on my arm in the chemistry one day when Jimmy Jiu-Jitsu was practising his karate. Anyway, it wasn't really an ordinary Monday. Things started to go wrong like in our first lesson, like Mr. Ryder's English class. When the desks, they started behaving badly. Now, you might say, what have I had for breakfast? But I told you what I had for breakfast, like 6 Weet-Bix or whatever. Anyway, Hilary Jacobson, she throws the chair down and she kicks the desk. And Mr. Ryder, like he gives a big lecture, he says, "You've got to respect the furniture." He says, "Hilary, how would you like it if the desk or the chairs did that to you?" And Hilary doesn't like lectures, so she says, "Oh, Mr. Ryder, you know, desks are just inanimate objects. They don't feel anything." Anyway, we were continuing doing our daily bash when suddenly Hilary's desk starts moving down to the front of the room. And Hilary's jaw dropped. It wasn't a pretty sight. And suddenly the desk starts moving back towards Hilary and gaining momentum, and then knocks Hilary off her chair. And then all the desks run out of the room. We were agog. We were lots of gogs, actually. And soon, Mr. Ryder, he regained composure, and he said to me, he said, "Hey, you." He doesn't know my name yet. He said, "Hey, you, go and tell Mr. in charge of school what's happened." Well, what was I going to say? Mr. in charge of school, the desks from Mr. Ryder's class have all ran away, which is exactly what I said. And he said, "Oh, look, I think you better go and see the Occupational Health and Safety Officer, Mr. What's Trouble." "What's trouble?" says old What's Trouble. I said, "The desks from Mr. Ryder's class, they've all run away." He says, "I think you better go and see the counsellor, like Mrs. Empathy." I don't think anyone believes me, but I know Mrs. Empathy. Well, she's a nice, kind lady. So I goes to Mrs. Empathy and I says, "Mrs. Empathy, the desks from Mr. Ryder's class have all run away." And she said, "And how do you feel?" And I said, tired. And she said, how long have you been feeling tired? I said, ever since everyone's asked me to run around the school talking about the desks who's run away. And then suddenly, like outside, we could see desks like running everywhere. And Mrs. Empathy, she was up like a shot and she bolted. She can spot a crisis 100 kilometres away, the old Mrs. Empathy. Anyway, I thought I better go back to my class. So I went back to my class and they're all standing there on the veranda outside the classroom and there's destruction and chaos everywhere. There's desks climbing trees, there's desks playing handball, there's desks sliding down the gymnasium roof. And then all of a sudden, the bell goes for chapel. And Mr. Ryder says, children, he says, don't go anywhere, just stay here. But an amazing thing happened. All the desks, they moved over to the chapel and lined up outside, just like we do. And Mr. Ryder says, hey, you. He still doesn't know my name. He says, hey, you. He says, go to the chapel and tell Pastor Purgatory that there's desks outside the chapel. So I raced over to the chapel, but before I got there, all the desks went inside the chapel. And when I went inside, like they were all in the pew thingies and downstairs and upstairs, and Pastor Purgatory was like talking. And I thought, oh no, Pastor Purgatory hasn't got his glasses on. I'm going to have to tell him what's happened. So anyway, I goes down the side of the sacristy and I calls out, I says, Pastor Purgatory, there's desks in the chapel. And he says, don't you mean pews? And anyway, just at that moment, like Hilary Jacobson starts walking down the front of the chapel and she says to Pastor Purgatory, she says, Pastor Purgatory, can I say a few words? And he says, you already have. And a bit of a wet the old Pastor P is. Anyway, he says, go on. And with that, she turned to all the desks in the chapel. And there was a hush. And it looked as though she was like crying. And she said, desks, I am sorry that I hurt you. I did not mean to, like, abuse you. I am so sorry, please forgive me. I need you. Our class needs you. The school needs you. And again, there was a hush. And suddenly, the desks erupted their lids in spontaneous applause. But then they listened quietly while, like, Pastor Purgatory finished his devotion. And then they all sang, the Lord is my desktop. And then they returned to the classrooms, but some of the small ones got mixed up with the big ones and ended up in the wrong classrooms. But, you know, like, I went home happy that day because Hilary Jacobson said something kind. And I realised that St. Petrowski's was not such a boring place after all. And Mr. Ryder, like, he asked me to write a story called The Day the Desks Attacked, and I've just told it to you. And as our cat Jurassic said, when he backed into Dad's lawnmower, that's the end of the tale.